A 4-year-old boy stood shivering in the snow for 3 days. No one in that town bothered to look at him. His mother was gone. A drunkard was dragging him away. And the only one who stepped forward to stop them was a scarred cowboy, wifeless, childless, and without a future. The boy looked up at him and asked a question that broke my heart. "Can you pretend to be my dad, just until Mom comes back?" Like, comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The snow had been falling for 11 days straight, and Gray Ridge looked less like a town than a thing the weather was trying to bury. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite. It settled in, got comfortable, worked its way through wool and leather and skin until a man couldn't remember what warmth felt like. The mountains to the north held the wind like a funnel, and by mid-December of 1885, the main street of Gray Ridge was a narrow canyon cut between walls of dirty ice. The storefronts huddled together as if for comfort they weren't quite finding. Silas Boone rode in from the east on a Monday, though he wouldn't have known it was Monday without checking. Days had lost their shape lately. He had a saddlebag half full of feed corn, a bruised left eye from a disagreement 3 towns back that he didn't particularly want to revisit, and $41 to his name, 20 of which he owed a man in Cullen Creek who was patient but not infinitely so. He wasn't planning to stop long. Get the feed, get the salt blocks, maybe get a whiskey if the price was reasonable. Then back to the ranch before the next front moved in, which the clouds were suggesting would be sometime around nightfall. He tied his horse at the rail outside Beller's general store and stamped the snow off his boots on the steps. And that was when he noticed her. She was sitting on an upturned crate beside the entrance of the Granger Inn, the building directly across the narrow street. Small, maybe 4 years old, maybe a little younger. It was hard to tell because she was wrapped in a coat that was too big for her. A man's coat or an older child's, brown wool gone gray with filth, the sleeves folded back 3 times so her hands could poke out. She had red mittens on. One of them had a hole in the thumb. She was sitting very still, which was what caught his eye first, because children that age didn't usually sit that still unless something was wrong. Silas stood on the steps of Beller's and looked at her for a moment. She was looking at the door of the inn with the focused patience of someone who had been looking at it for a long time and had not yet decided to stop believing it would open. He went inside and got his supplies. Hector Beller was a talker, which was either a virtue or a fault depending on how much time you had. Today, Silas had a little, so he let the man run while he filled his order: flour, salt, a block of lard, the corn, and listened to the usual complaints about the territorial governor and the price of timber and the fact that the Alderman brothers had gotten into it again at the saloon 2 weeks back, and one of them still wasn't walking right. "What about the kid across the street?" Silas said when there was a pause. Beller glanced toward the window. "Which one?" "The little one, sitting outside the inn, red mittens." Beller's expression did a complicated thing, started toward concern, then detoured around it into something more like exhaustion. "That's Rowan's girl. Her mother checked in 3 days ago, left the child outside while she went to sort something, said she'd be back inside the hour." He began tallying Silas's goods on a slip of paper. "Nobody's seen the woman since." Silas was quiet for a second. 3 days. "It's not my business what goes on over at Granger's. Mabel Granger tried to bring the girl inside the first night, but the child wouldn't leave the step. Said her mama told her to wait." He shrugged, not comfortably. "What are you going to do?" It wasn't really a question. Silas paid for his supplies, carried them out, loaded them onto the horse. He looked at the girl again. She hadn't moved. A woman in a fur collar walked past her on the boardwalk and stepped around her without looking down, the way you step around a post or a gap in the planking, automatically, without acknowledgement. He crossed the street. Up close she was worse. Her lips had gone a color that wasn't healthy, a grayish blue underneath the chapping. Her cheeks were red, but the wrong kind of red, raw and windburned rather than warm. The coat she was wearing was doing its best, but it wasn't enough. It had never been enough for this kind of cold. There was a canvas sack next to the crate that he assumed held whatever belongings she had. She was clutching the top of it with both mittened hands, and she looked up at him when his shadow crossed her, and her eyes were serious and dark and extraordinarily tired. "Hey," he said. "Hello," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying some time ago, and had finished with it. "How long have you been out here?" She thought about it with more concentration than the question seemed to require. "Since the snow came again," she said finally. "The last time." The last substantial snowfall had been 3 days ago, which confirmed what Beller had told him. "You eat anything today?" She shook her head. "Yesterday?" A pause. Then another head shake, less certain, like she wasn't entirely sure what yesterday meant anymore. Silas crouched down so he was at her level, which put his knees in the snow and immediately soaked through his pants, but he didn't particularly register it. "Where's your mama?" "She went to get food," the girl said. "She said she'd come back." "Okay." He kept his voice even. "What's your name?" "Elsie." "Elsie what?" "Elsie Rowan." She studied his face with that particular seriousness children have when they're trying to figure out if an adult can be trusted, running some internal calculation that adults have mostly forgotten how to do. "You have a cut," she said. "On your chin." He touched it. Hadn't noticed it was still visible. "I do. Old one." "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore." She nodded like that was a satisfying answer. Then she looked back at the door of the inn. Silas stayed where he was. He knew he should stand up, get on his horse, ride home. The feed wasn't going to get itself to the barn, and he had maybe 4 hours of decent light left. This wasn't his problem. He didn't even particularly like children, or more accurately, he didn't know how to be around them, which sometimes looked like the same thing from the outside. He was still trying to talk himself into leaving when he heard the boots. The man coming down the boardwalk from the direction of the saloon was large and unsteady and had the particular expression of someone who had been drinking since morning and had reached the mean stretch of it. He wore a sheepskin coat with a tear in the shoulder and a hat pulled down low, and he was looking at Elsie with the kind of attention that made the back of Silas's neck go tight. "Hey, little girl!" The man stopped at the edge of the boardwalk above them, swaying just slightly. "Your mama's not coming back, you know that? She left you." Elsie's jaw tightened, but she didn't look at him. "I know a place you can stay. Get warm." The man stepped down off the boardwalk into the street. He was smiling in a way that didn't have anything good in it. "Come on now, don't be stubborn." He reached down and got a hand around Elsie's arm. Silas stood up. He didn't do it fast or dramatically. He just unfolded himself from his crouch and stood, which put him about 4 inches taller than the drunk and considerably broader across the shoulders. And he looked at the hand on Elsie's arm and then at the man's face, and he said quietly, "Let go of her." The man blinked. He hadn't noticed Silas crouching there, or maybe he had and hadn't cared and was now reevaluating. "Mind your business, stranger." "I'm making it my business," Silas said. "Let go of her arm." There was a long moment. The drunk was calculating, the same way the girl had calculated, but reaching different conclusions. Whatever he found in Silas's face, the scarring along the jaw, the stillness, the specific quality of attention that a man develops after enough years of not walking away from things, it apparently did its job. He released Elsie's arm and stepped back, muttering something that was probably an insult but not loud enough to require a response, and he went off down the street with the dignity of a man pretending he'd made the choice himself. Silas watched him until he turned a corner. Then he looked down at Elsie. She was looking up at him. Her dark eyes had gone a little wider, and her chin was set, but her hands were trembling against the canvas sack. Or maybe they'd been trembling before, from the cold, and he was only noticing it now. "Thank you," she said, with the formal gravity of a child who had been taught manners and was using them because she didn't know what else to use. "You're welcome." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a smaller voice, "Are you leaving?" He looked at her. At the door of the inn that had not opened in 3 days. At the street where no one had stopped, where a woman in a fur collar had walked past a 4-year-old freezing to death on a crate and not looked down. "Not just yet," he said. She reached up with one of her mittened hands, the one with the hole in the thumb, and she took hold of 2 fingers of his right hand and held on. Not tightly. She didn't squeeze, didn't cling, just held, the way you hold something you're not sure you're allowed to keep. "Mister," she said, "could you—" She stopped, started again. "Could you maybe pretend to be my daddy, just until Mama comes back?" The street was very quiet around them. Snow was starting again, light and dry, sifting down through the gray afternoon air. Silas Boone had not cried since he was 9 years old when his father's horse came home without his father. He did not cry now. But something shifted in his chest, some old arrangement of scar tissue and distance, and he felt it move, felt the thing he'd built around himself flex and crack just slightly, the way river ice does in late winter before you know the thaw has started. He looked at her small hand holding his 2 fingers. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." He picked her up. She was lighter than she should have been, lighter than a child that age should ever be. And she was cold all the way through, a cold that had gotten into her the way the winter had gotten into the mountains, deep and settled. She put her arms around his neck with a trust that he hadn't earned and didn't know what to do with. And he stood there in the street with her while the snow came down, and he didn't put her back down. He carried her into the Granger Inn instead, still holding her canvas sack in his free hand. And he went to the desk where Mabel Granger sat knitting and looking guilty about it, and he said, "I need to know everything you know about this child's mother. And then I need a room with a fireplace." Mabel set down her knitting. She told him what she knew, which wasn't much. A woman named Nora Rowan, traveling alone with her daughter, had checked in 5 days ago looking exhausted and frightened in the way that Mabel recognized from having seen it before. Not frightened of the road or the weather, but frightened of something specific and human and following close behind. She had paid 2 nights in advance with coins that looked counted out carefully. On the 3rd morning, she had taken the child outside, spoken to her in a low, urgent voice for several minutes, kissed her on both cheeks, and walked away down the street without looking back. "She left something with me," Mabel said, and she took from beneath the desk a folded handkerchief, white cotton with a blue edge, tied shut with a piece of thread. Said if someone came asking for the girl, to give them this. Said it would explain. Silas took it. He didn't open it yet. He got the room with the fireplace on the 2nd floor, and he built the fire up high, and he sat Elsie in front of it, wrapped in both blankets from the bed, and he ordered hot broth from the kitchen, which the kitchen produced in the form of a thin but genuine beef soup that Elsie ate with slow concentration, both hands around the bowl. He sat in the chair across the fire from her and watched her start to come back, the color returning to her face, the shaking in her hands easing, the heaviness around her eyes softening into something closer to simple tiredness. "Your mama loves you," he said. He said it because it was the thing that needed saying, not because he was certain it was true, though he was beginning to think it might be. Elsie looked at the fire. "I know," she said. "She told me to wait. And you waited. 3 days, she said, with a kind of quiet dignity that was so out of scale with how small she was that it did something to him all over again. He waited until she'd finished the soup and fallen asleep curled in the blankets, one red mitten on and one red mitten off, and then he untied the handkerchief and opened it in the firelight. Inside was a note. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, the letters pressed hard into the paper as if the pen were the only thing the writer could control. "If you are reading this, you are the one who stayed. Please keep her safe. I am not abandoning her. I am drawing him away. He has tracked us from Dunmore. If I stay, he finds us both. If I go, he follows me, and she has a chance. Her name is Elsie. She is 4 years and 2 months old. She is everything. I will come back. If I can come back, I will. N. Rowan." Silas read it twice. Then he folded it back into the handkerchief and held it in his hands and looked at the sleeping child and at the fire. Outside, the snow was still falling, filling in the tracks he'd made crossing the street, filling in the tracks the drunk had made, covering everything in that particular silence that snow makes when it's deep enough, when the world goes muffled and still and you can almost pretend that the danger is somewhere far away. He didn't pretend that. He sat in the chair with the note in his hands, and he thought about a woman walking away down a street without looking back, drawing something terrible after her so her daughter could live. He thought about a child sitting on a crate in the cold for 3 days, holding on to the promise of someone coming back. He thought about what kind of man he was and what kind of man he might still become. Then he put the note in his breast pocket, close to his chest, and he settled back in the chair. And he kept watch over the sleeping girl while the fire burned and the snow came down over Gray Ridge, covering everything equally, the way snow does. The merciful and the broken and the quietly stubborn, all of it together, waiting for spring. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He dozed in the chair twice. Short, shallow drops into something that wasn't quite rest. And both times he came back up fast, the way he always did. Heart already steady, hand already knowing where the rifle leaned against the wall, eyes open and checking the room before his mind had fully arrived. Old habit, the kind that got built over years and didn't unbuild just because the situation changed. Elsie slept through the night without waking, which told him more about how exhausted she'd been than about how comfortable she was. She'd curled herself into a tight ball under both blankets with her knees pulled up and her chin tucked down, and she hadn't moved much at all. Just breathed, slow and even, the fire throwing light and shadow across her face. He watched the fire burn down and built it back up twice. He kept the note in his breast pocket. He thought, by the time gray light started showing around the edge of the curtain, he'd made a decision, or maybe the decision had already been made the moment he'd picked her up in the street and she'd put her arms around his neck. He wasn't sure anymore where the choosing had happened. It didn't matter much. What mattered was that there was a child who had no one, and a woman somewhere out in that winter who had walked away from her daughter to save her, and whatever came next had to start with getting Elsie somewhere safer than a hotel room in a town that had already demonstrated what it thought of the situation. When Elsie woke, she did it quietly, just opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way children do when they're remembering where they are. Then she turned her head and found him in the chair, and something in her small face settled, like a knot coming loose. "You stayed," she said. Said I would. She sat up. The blankets fell away, and she looked down at herself and then around the room, taking inventory the way he'd noticed she did. Methodical. Those serious dark eyes moving from the fire to the window to the door to him. "Is Mama here?" "Not yet." He kept his voice level. "But we're going to go somewhere safer to wait for her, you understand? Somewhere she can find us." Elsie thought about this. How will she know where? "I'll make sure she knows." He didn't know yet exactly how he'd do that, but it was the kind of problem that had solutions if you worked at it. "Can you get dressed?" She could. She was slower than she'd probably been before 3 days of cold and no food had taken the edge off her, but she managed her buttons herself and only asked for help with the laces on her boots, which were stiff and slightly too large. Someone else's boots were soled and handed down. He tied them without comment. She watched him do it with that same measuring attention. "You have big hands," she observed. "I do. My papa had big hands." A pause. He went away. Silas didn't ask when or where. "Ready?" "Yes," she said, and picked up her canvas sack. The road back to the ranch was 12 miles of bad going in good weather. In the current conditions, it was closer to 3 hours with care, the horse picking its way along the trail where the snow had packed enough to hold, Elsie sitting in front of Silas on the saddle, wrapped in his coat over her own. She asked questions for the first hour. About the horse's name, which was Harlan, about whether Harlan liked the cold, about whether Silas had any food at his house, about how far away it was. And then she went quiet, and he felt her lean back against his chest and go heavy the way children do when they fall asleep without meaning to. He kept one arm around her and rode the rest of the way like that. Through the white silence, the pine trees standing under their loads of snow, the mountains ahead gray and indifferent. He tried to think practically. The ranch had enough firewood stacked for another 3 weeks at least. There was salt pork and dried beans and a sack of oats. He'd need to get more flour, and the milk cow was temperamental in cold weather, but she was still producing. He could make this work in the short term. The longer term was a different question, and he didn't let himself look at it directly yet. The ranch sat in a shallow bowl between 2 ridgelines, sheltered enough that the snow around it was only knee-deep rather than the chest-deep drifts on the exposed trail. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone hearth, a sleeping loft, a lean-to kitchen attached on the east side. But it was solid, built by the man Silas had bought the land from, who'd understood that in this country, solid was the only thing that lasted. There was a barn large enough for 4 horses, currently housing Harlan and 2 others, and a chicken coop that had survived every winter so far through stubbornness rather than design. Elsie woke up when Harlan stopped. She looked around at the ranch with the same methodical inventory she'd applied to the hotel room. "It's small," she said. "It is. But it's got a chimney. 2 of them." She considered this favorably, apparently, because she let him lift her down without protest and walked to the cabin door with the canvas sack bumping against her leg. And when he got the door open and the cold air inside hit them both, she walked in and went directly to the hearth and crouched in front of it and looked at the cold ash as if she were deciding what to do about it. "I know how to do fires," she announced. "Mama showed me." "Good," he said. "Then you can do that while I see to the horse." She looked up at him. Apparently she'd expected to be told no, because the yes surprised her. She nodded seriously and pulled off her mittens and got to work, and he went back out to the barn feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not warmth exactly, or not only that. Something closer to the specific weight of being needed, which was a thing he hadn't felt in a while and hadn't realized he'd been missing. The fire was going when he came back in, small but real, built with the particular care of someone who'd been taught that you don't waste kindling. She'd fed it correctly. Tinder first, then the small pieces, then a larger log on top once the small one's caught. And she was kneeling in front of it with her hands out, watching it like she was proud of it, which she should have been. "Good fire," he said. "I know," she said, without vanity, just fact. He made oatmeal on the stove and she ate 2 bowls without stopping and then sat back in the chair nearest the hearth and watched him eat his with the focused attention of someone who had recently learned not to take meals for granted. When he was done, she said, "Will you look for my mama?" "Yes." "When?" "Soon as I can arrange it. I need to figure out what direction she might have gone first." Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out something she'd had under there. A small, folded piece of paper, soft from handling, the creases gone gray. She held it out to him. He took it. When he unfolded it, it was a list of towns in a woman's handwriting. The same handwriting as the note in his pocket. He could see that immediately. The same compressed, forward-leaning letters, the same hard press on the downstrokes. 5 towns were listed: Dunmore, Calverton, Sutter's Ford, Grey Ridge, Millhaven. Grey Ridge had a small mark next to it, a dash rather than a check, as if it were a waypoint rather than a destination. "She gave you this?" he asked. Elsie nodded. "Before she left. She said if anything happened, I should give it to a grown-up I trusted." He looked at the list. "Why me?" The girl considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "You didn't walk past me," she said finally. He folded the list carefully and put it with the note. Outside, the wind had come up, throwing snow against the cabin's single window in dry, scratching bursts. He thought about the towns on the list, about the spacing between them, about a woman moving through the same winter with someone behind her. Millhaven was northeast, about 40 miles. If she'd left Grey Ridge heading northeast to draw pursuit away, Millhaven was the next logical stop. Or Sutter's Ford, which branched off the main trail about 20 miles out. The problem was that he couldn't leave Elsie alone to go looking, and he couldn't take her with him into whatever situation her mother had fled from, which meant he needed someone to stay with her, and his options in that department were limited almost to nothing. He thought of May Hutter. May was 63 years old and had lived alone on a homestead 4 miles east since her husband Kurt died of a burst appendix 7 years back. She was not what anyone would call warm. She was direct to the point of abrasion, had opinions about everything and shared them without being asked, and kept a shotgun by her door that she was not shy about producing. But she was reliable in the way that certain people are reliable, the way the mountains are reliable, not because they're gentle, but because they don't shift. He'd helped her repair her roof in the fall. She'd paid him in pickled beets, which he didn't particularly like, but which represented a genuine exchange, and he respected that. It took him a day and a half to arrange. He rode to May's the next morning, explained the situation with the brevity he'd learned she preferred, and watched her face go through several things before settling into something that looked like controlled indignation. Not at him, he thought, but at the general state of affairs that produced freezing children on crates. "How old?" she said. 4, maybe 4.5. "She eat, like she's making up for lost time." May looked at him for a long moment. She had pale blue eyes that had gone watery with age, but were still sharp in the way that mattered. "You're not exactly set up for this." "I know." "You know anything about children?" "No." "At least you're honest about it." She pulled her coat off the hook by the door. "I'll come. 3 days. That's what I can manage before my stock needs proper attention again. If you're not back in 3 days, you find another arrangement." "Understood," he said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Bring the girl back something useful. She doesn't need sentiment, she needs boots that fit. He brought Elsie to May's homestead that afternoon, rather than the other way around. May's place was sturdier and had a second bedroom, which his cabin did not. And he watched the introduction with some apprehension. Elsie looked up at May with her measuring eyes. May looked down at Elsie with her pale blue ones. "You know how to knead bread?" May said. "No," Elsie said. "You're going to learn." May held the door open. "Come in before you let all the heat out." Elsie went in. Silas stood on the steps until May looked at him over her shoulder and said, "Go," in a tone that didn't invite discussion. He went. The first day he rode to Sutter's Ford, which was wrong, no sign of a woman passing through matching the description, nothing unusual in the last week except a broken wheel on a freight wagon that had held up traffic for a morning. The bartender at the only saloon there shrugged when Silas described Nora Rowan and said he saw women come through, but not women traveling alone in December. That wasn't common. Silas believed him and rode back through the dark, which he shouldn't have done but did because time was a problem. The second day he went northeast toward Millhaven, taking the main trail and then cutting off it onto a smaller track that local trappers used, one that ran closer to the tree line and provided some shelter from the wind. He'd gone about 14 miles when he found the tracks. They'd been partially filled in by blowing snow, but the ground beneath was hard-packed and they'd pressed deep enough to survive. The narrow prints of a woman's boots, the gait uneven, favoring the right, moving northeast along the tree line. He followed them for 2 miles before he lost them, where the wind had scoured the exposed hillside clean. But he knew the direction. And he'd seen something else before he lost the trail. A spot where she'd stopped, crouched. He could see the knee prints in the snow. And where the snow around her was slightly disturbed in a pattern that suggested she'd been sick or had sat there long enough that she'd had to put her hands down. Either she was hurt or she was exhausted past the point of just pushing through. He made Millhaven by early afternoon. It was bigger than Gray Ridge, a proper town with a main street long enough to have 2 mercantiles and a hotel that wasn't just a converted house. He started with the hotel. The woman at the desk was young and had the careful manner of someone who'd been told to be discreet with information about guests. He understood the instinct, but he didn't have time for it, so he put the note and the list on the counter where she could see them without touching them and explained briefly what they were. The woman looked at them. Then she looked at him. "She's here," she said quietly. "Room 6. But I need you to know, she's in bad shape. She came in yesterday evening and she could barely stand up, and I don't think she's a woman in bad shape because of the road." He understood what she meant. "I'm not going to make it worse. Room 6 is at the top of the stairs, second on the right. She hasn't come down this morning. I took up tea and she answered the door, but she didn't look right." He went up. He knocked on the door of room 6 and waited. Silence. He knocked again. "Mrs. Rowan? My name is Silas Boone. I have your daughter. She's safe." A long pause. Then the sound of movement. Slow, careful movement, the kind that suggested parts of the body that were tender. The door opened. Nora Rowan was not what he'd built in his mind from the note, which had been written with a kind of concentrated desperation that he'd imagined attached to a certain look. Wild-eyed, maybe. Frantic. She wasn't any of those things. She was slight, dark-haired, probably 30 or a little under, and she had a bruise along the left side of her jaw that had gone from purple to the yellow-green of an injury 3 or 4 days old, and a cut above her left eyebrow that someone had closed roughly with 2 strips of plaster. She was wearing a dress that had once been a reasonable garment and had not been improved by whatever the last week had put it through. She looked at him. Her eyes were the same dark shade as Elsie's, which answered a question he hadn't consciously asked. They were also red-rimmed and deeply tired, and they went immediately to his face with an urgency that was almost physical. "She's safe," he said again. "She's with a neighbor of mine, a woman, 4 miles east of my ranch. She ate, she slept. She's fine." Nora's face did something complicated and difficult. She put one hand on the doorframe and the other over her mouth, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and whatever she was holding together by force of will, she let herself stop holding just briefly in the way people do when they finally reach somewhere that feels like it might possibly be safe. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady, mostly. "Okay. Can I come in?" She stepped back. The room was small and cold, and she'd been in it long enough that her few things were spread around. A coat on the chair, a small bag open on the floor, a pair of boots near the door that she'd clearly taken off and not had the energy to move. She sat on the edge of the bed because there was no other place to sit except the chair with the coat, and he stood because that felt less presumptuous. "You read my note," she said. "And the list Elsie had." She nodded slowly. She held on to it. "Good girl." A pause. "She wasn't supposed to be out there more than a few hours. I thought I was going to come back once I was sure he'd followed me, and then I was going to get her and we were going to take the Millhaven Road and lose him somewhere in the mountains." Her voice was flat, describing this, the flat of someone reciting something they've gone over too many times. He caught up faster than I expected. I didn't have a choice. "Who is he?" She looked at the window. "My husband, Clyde Rowan." The name came out with the specific weight of something you say carefully, because saying it carelessly still costs you something. "We've been running from him since September, Dunmore first, then Calverton. I thought we'd lost him at Sutter's Ford." A pause. "We hadn't." "Where is he now?" "I don't know." She said it steadily, which he suspected took effort. "He followed me out of Grey Ridge. I went north first, then cut east. I was trying to get him turned around in the hill country. I think I managed it, but I'm not certain." Her eyes came back to his face. "How did you find me?" "Tracks and the list. You tracked me 14 miles in a December snowstorm." 12, he said. "The first 2 I had to ride back." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not suspicion, but something that wasn't trust yet either. The careful look of someone who had learned that help from strangers almost always came with a cost that wasn't disclosed up front. He recognized it because he'd worn the same look himself once. "What do you want?" she said. Direct. He appreciated it. "To get you back to Elsie," he said. "After that, we figure out the rest." "There's no we," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "You don't know what's involved." "I've got a general picture," he said. "A man with a history of violence who thinks his legal status as a husband gives him the right to do whatever he likes, and who's been hunting you across 4 towns in the dead of winter. That about right?" She didn't answer, which was an answer. "I'm not asking to be involved," Silas said. "I'm saying I already am, because I picked up your daughter off a crate in Grey Ridge, and I made her a promise, and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." He paused. "She asked me to pretend to be her father, just until you came back. I said I would." Another pause. "You're back. So the question is what happens next, and I think that's a conversation you and I need to have before we walk back into whatever Clyde Rowan has planned." Nora was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands in her lap, which were chapped and slightly swollen at the knuckles from the cold, and she turned them over once, then back. "He has papers," she said finally. "A marriage certificate. He's talked to lawyers about legal custody. He told me, before I left Dunmore, he said the law was on his side and I'd be running forever." She looked up. "He might not be wrong about that." "What kind of papers does he have?" "I don't know exactly. He said legal documents. He has money. More than I ever knew, from sources I was never told about. He can hire people." She said it without self-pity, just inventory, the same way Elsie cataloged rooms. "I have nothing. I have a daughter and a canvas bag and however much is left from what I took when I left." Silas thought about the land deed in the box under his bunk, about the ranch, small as it was, that had his name on it, about the 2 witnesses who'd signed when he'd bought the land, who were still in the county and would remember. About the fact that Clyde Rowan, for all his money and his papers, did not know yet where Elsie was, only that she'd been in Grey Ridge, and that a man had interfered with someone trying to take her. He thought about what 3 days' head start and the right kind of preparation could do. "Rest today, Presets," he said. "I'll get you something to eat from the kitchen downstairs and we'll ride tomorrow morning. Can you ride?" She gave him a look that suggested the question was slightly insulting. "I grew up on a farm." "Good." He went to the door. "You need anything else tonight?" "No." A pause. "Mr. Boone." He turned. "Why?" she said. Just that. One word, but he understood the whole weight of what she was asking. Why any of it? Why a stranger with nothing to gain had ridden 12 miles into a December snowstorm for a woman he'd never met, based on a note tucked in a handkerchief. He thought about Elsie's hand holding his 2 fingers, about the weight of her against his chest on the ride to the ranch, trusting him with her whole body, the way children trust before they've learned not to, about the fire she'd built, small and careful and right. She waited 3 days, he said. For you. 3 days in the cold, and she never stopped believing you'd come back. Nora's face went very still. That kind of faith, Silas said, deserves to land somewhere solid. He went downstairs and ordered a plate from the kitchen. Whatever was hot, he told them, enough for one person who needed it. And he paid for another night in the room and went and stood by the hotel's front window and looked out at the street in the gathering dusk. The snow had stopped for now, which meant the sky was clear and the temperature was dropping fast, the stars coming out hard and cold overhead. Somewhere out there, Clyde Rowan was moving through the same dark, probably angry, probably recalculating. A man like that, and Silas had known a few, had in fact worked for one, briefly, years ago, before he understood what kind of work it was. A man like that didn't stop because the trail went cold. He adjusted. He found other angles. The papers Nora had mentioned were a problem. Legal documents, real or constructed, gave a man like Clyde Rowan something more dangerous than violence: legitimacy. The ability to walk into a sheriff's office in any town and make his case before anyone had heard the other side. The ability to make running look like the crime rather than the thing he was doing that caused the running. Silas stayed at the window until the food was ready, and then he took it upstairs and knocked on the door. And Nora opened it and took the plate with a thank you that was simple and direct and had no performance in it. And he went back down and found a chair in the hotel's small common room and sat with a cup of coffee he didn't much taste, thinking through it. There were things that could be done. He didn't want to get ahead of himself, but there were things. The sheriff in Millhaven was a man named Casper Dunn, who he'd crossed paths with twice. Not a friend, but a straight dealer, the kind who actually read the documents before deciding which side they supported. That mattered. And there was a lawyer in Grey Ridge, name of Aldridge, who had a reputation for being more interested in what was right than in who had more money, which was rare enough in this territory that people noticed. He wasn't planning a war. He was planning a position, a place to stand when Clyde Rowan showed up, because Clyde Rowan was going to show up, and the time to prepare was before, not during. He finished the coffee and got a room for himself and slept for the first time in 2 days, genuinely slept, and in the morning they rode. Nora was stiff and sore. She didn't say so, but he could see it in the way she mounted, the careful economy of someone managing pain, and they took it slower than he would have on his own, which was fine. She knew how to read the trail, he noticed. She picked the right footing without being told, compensated for the horse's preferences without fighting them. Someone had taught her well, and she'd retained it. They talked some, not about Clyde, not about what came next. Those were conversations that needed 4 walls and a fire, not an open trail in the cold. She asked about the ranch, neutral ground, and he described it without embellishment. The acreage, the state of the barn, the temperamental milk cow. She asked about May Hutter, and he described her with the same plainness, which made Nora smile slightly. A brief thing, there and gone. She sounds like she doesn't suffer fools, Nora said. She doesn't, but she's fair. Fair's worth more than nice. He agreed with that. They reached May's homestead in the early afternoon. He'd barely gotten Nora's horse tied at the rail when the door opened and Elsie appeared in the gap. And then Elsie was running through the snow in her 2 large boots, and Nora was off the horse faster than her soreness should have allowed. And they met in the yard and went down together into the snow, Nora on her knees, Elsie's arms around her neck. And he stood by the horses and looked at the mountains and gave them whatever privacy that position afforded. He heard Elsie say, muffled, "You came back," and Nora's voice lower, "I said I would." 3 days, Elsie said. "I know, baby, I know." May appeared in the doorway, flour on her hands from the bread she'd apparently been teaching Elsie to make. He could see the slightly accusatory look she leveled at him, which he took to mean she was glad but wasn't going to say so in a way that committed her to anything. "Get them inside," May said. "Both of them. You too." "I made soup." He got them inside. Nora sat at May's table and drank the soup with one hand, because Elsie had taken possession of the other hand and wasn't releasing it, and she let herself be held without pulling away or hurrying it. She looked around May's kitchen with those steady dark eyes, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the good solid stove, the shelves of preserved things, and something in her settled, the way Elsie had settled when she'd woken up and found him still in the chair. May sat across from her and didn't say anything, which was the kindest thing May was capable of doing and probably the hardest. Later, after Elsie had fallen asleep on May's bed in a posture of utter rightful exhaustion, one arm around Nora, face pressed into her mother's side, completely and utterly done, Silas sat with the two women at the table, and they talked quietly about what was real and what could be done about it. Nora laid it out simply. Clyde Rowan had come from money, had more of it than she'd ever known about, and had connections in the county where they'd been married that she didn't trust. He had filed some kind of legal complaint in Dunmore. She'd been told by a neighbor before she left. A complaint about a wife who'd abandoned her lawful husband and taken property that belonged to him, by which he meant Elsie. She had no documentation that contradicted this, except her own account of 3 years of things she could describe but not prove, because the kinds of things Clyde Rowan did left no paperwork. A woman came through Grey Ridge last month, May said abruptly, selling medicine. She had a black eye she'd stopped trying to explain. Nobody said anything about this. There wasn't anything to say about it that added to the facts. There's a lawyer in Grey Ridge, Silas said. Aldridge. He's done right by people in tight situations before. I think we should talk to him. Nora looked at him. I can't pay him. I didn't say anything about payment. She held his gaze for a moment, that same careful measuring look she'd given him from the doorway of room 6, trying to find the cost in it, the thing he wanted in return. He let her look. All right, she said finally. We talked to Aldridge. May stood up and began clearing the soup bowls with the brisk efficiency of someone ending a meeting. You'll both stay here tonight, she said. It wasn't an offer. There's room enough. Tomorrow is tomorrow. Tomorrow was tomorrow. But through the small window over May's sink, past the dark shapes of the pine trees along the ridge, the sky was still and cold and clear, and somewhere in it, Silas knew, was a man who was not the kind to let a trail go cold because the snow had come. He had not yet come, but he was coming. They rode to Grey Ridge the next morning, the three of them, May staying behind with her stock and a look on her face that said she didn't like it, but understood that some things had to happen in the order they happened. Aldridge's office was above the feed store on the main street, a single room with a window that overlooked the road and enough paper stacked on every flat surface that the desk had essentially ceased to function as a desk and become more of an archaeological site. The lawyer himself was a thin man in his mid-50s with ink-stained fingers and reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose, and he listened to Nora talk for 20 minutes without interrupting, which Silas took as a sign of either unusual patience or unusual interest in what she was saying. When she finished, Aldridge took off his glasses and set them on the nearest stack of paper. He filed a desertion complaint in Dunmore, he said. That's one instrument. With money behind it, he could get a territorial judge to issue an order for the child's return. That's the real weapon. He wouldn't be looking to get his wife back, I'd imagine. He'd be looking to use the child as leverage to compel her return, or to punish her for leaving. He looked at Nora steadily. That's how these things work. The law doesn't always ask the right questions. I know, Nora said. What I can do, Aldridge continued, is begin building a counter-record. If you can give me specifics, dates, injuries, incidents, anything witnessed by anyone else, even people unlikely to speak publicly, I can start constructing an affidavit that complicates his position. He paused. I won't charge you for the work. I'll charge him when this resolves, if there's anything to collect from that end. If not, I've had worse uses of my time. Nora looked at him with that careful measuring quality she had. Why? Aldridge almost smiled. Because the law is supposed to protect people from harm, Mrs. Rowan, and too often it gets used as the harm itself. I find that professionally irritating. He picked his glasses back up. Come back tomorrow morning with everything you can remember. They left his office, and Silas felt marginally better. Not safe, but better, which in his experience was all you could reasonably ask for one step at a time. They got supplies at Beller's and were back at the ranch by late afternoon, the winter light already going orange and flat against the snow. The ranch felt different with them in it. He noticed it the moment they came through the door. The way Elsie immediately went to the hearth and examined the condition of the fire with proprietary interest. The way Nora set her bag down not by the door where a guest would put it, but at the base of the loft ladder. An instinct toward occupying the space rather than passing through it. He didn't say anything about it. He went and started supper. They fell into a working rhythm that evening without discussing it, the way people do when everyone has enough experience with practical necessity to skip the negotiation. Nora cooked. She was better at it than him, which became clear in about 4 minutes and which he accepted without comment. Elsie set the table with the focused ceremony she brought to most tasks, aligning the forks with a precision that probably exceeded the situation's requirements. He kept the fire and brought in the last of the day's wood and checked the bar on the door and checked the window latches, and if either of them noticed the security inspection, neither mentioned it. Over supper, Elsie talked. She'd been quieter than her nature probably allowed over the last few days. Conservation of energy or some child's understanding that the adults around her were managing things that needed managing, but tonight she was back, telling Nora about May's bread lesson with great specificity, about Harlan the horse and his opinions about the cold, about the fire she'd built in the hotel room in Millhaven, that she was under the impression she'd done without supervision, which he decided not to correct. Nora listened with her whole attention in the way she had, and the bruise along her jaw had deepened in color through the day, the way healing bruises do before they start to fade, and Silas watched her when she wasn't watching him and thought about Aldridge's words. The law gets used as the harm itself. He'd seen that. He'd seen how a man with the right papers and the right connections could make the truth irrelevant, could take a legal structure that existed to protect people and use it instead as a tool to pin someone in place while he did whatever he liked. He wasn't going to let that happen here. He hadn't made that decision at any single clear moment. It had arrived gradually, the way the cold arrived, until it was just the temperature of everything, the given condition. After Elsie was asleep in the loft, she'd climbed up without being asked, carrying her canvas sack, and they'd heard her settle and go quiet within minutes. Silas and Nora sat at the table with coffee going cold between them and talked in the low register that adults use when there's a child sleeping nearby. "He'll come here," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How long do you think we have?" He considered it honestly. He lost the trail somewhere in the hill country north of Millhaven. That's my guess, based on the direction you went. He'll have to backtrack, ask around. But he'll find Grey Ridge eventually. You were there 5 days. People saw you. He paused. A week, maybe less. Nora looked at her coffee. "I don't want to run again." "I know." "Elsie's tired. I'm tired." She said it plainly, no self-pity in it. "And running just keeps the problem mobile. It doesn't end it." "No, it doesn't." She looked at him across the table. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles." "I know that too." He turned his cup once in his hands. "But this is my land, and you're on it. That makes it my business by simple geography." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "Simple geography. I'm not a complicated man." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that meant she didn't fully believe that, but wasn't going to argue it. "What are you thinking?" He told her. He laid it out in the same plain terms he'd used with May. The ranch's position in the bowl between the ridge lines, the approaches, the structures that could be used, and the ones that were liabilities. He told her about the 2 rifles and the handgun under the bunk, and the ammunition, and the fact that he'd been in enough bad situations to know that terrain and preparation counted for more than numbers. Nora listened carefully. She didn't flinch at the specifics, didn't perform nervousness. "He won't come alone," she said. "He brought men into Calverton, 2 of them, hired. He'll have more this time because he knows what he's dealing with now." "How many men does his money buy?" "I don't know. 4, maybe 5. She paused. "One of them is named Harker. He's the dangerous one. The others are hired muscle, but Harker thinks." She said it with the specific fear of someone who'd seen what thinking violence looks like compared to the random kind. Silas noted the name. "We've got time to prepare, if we use it." "And Aldridge?" "Aldridge is the long game. He builds the record, we hold the position, And when this resolves, we have something to show a judge that isn't just our word against Clyde Rowan's money. He looked at her. But the immediate problem is immediate. She nodded slowly. All right. A pause. I can shoot. I figured. Don't do that, she said. What? Figure things about me before I tell you. I might surprise you. He thought about that. Fair enough. They spent the next 4 days preparing, which was not a word that covered the full reality of what it involved. Silas worked the property with the methodical attention of someone who had to make a small thing serve large purposes. He banked snow against the windward walls of the cabin to deaden sound from inside. He cut a second firing position into the hayloft of the barn, a gap between the boards that gave a sight line down the main approach from the east without being visible from outside. He identified the low ground behind the chicken coop where the terrain made an approach from the north awkward, and he set a wire at ankle height across it, not to stop anyone but to make noise and slow them down. Nora worked alongside him without being asked to. She was methodical too, which didn't surprise him anymore. She reshingled a section of the barn roof that had been letting in wind and snow, not because the ranch needed it, but because they needed the barn to be usable and dry. And she inventoried his ammunition with an accuracy that confirmed she knew what she was looking at. She also spent time each day with the rifle, working the action, getting comfortable with its particular weight and balance, doing it quietly behind the barn where Elsie wouldn't see. Elsie saw anyway. Silas knew this because he found her once, standing at the corner of the barn, watching her mother with an expression that was too old for her face. Not frightened exactly, but waited, knowing. He stood beside her and let the moment be what it was. Is the bad man coming? Elsie said. He crouched down to her level. He'd gotten in the habit of that. It had started as a practical measure, communicating with someone that short, and had become something else he didn't have a name for. Maybe, he said. We're getting ready, just in case. Getting ready means the rifle. Part of it. She thought about this. May has a shotgun, she said. She does. She says a woman with a shotgun doesn't need to ask twice. Elsie considered this. I think that's smart. It is, he said. May is smart. Elsie looked at him sideways with her mother's measuring eyes. Are you scared? He thought about whether to answer honestly or helpfully, and decided the two weren't necessarily different with her. A little, he said. Being a little scared is useful. It keeps you paying attention. She nodded like she was filing this away. Okay, she said, and went back to the cabin, apparently satisfied. On the 5th morning, the signs came. Silas was breaking ice on the water trough at first light when he noticed the tracks along the eastern ridge. Not fresh, but not old either. The clean edges still defined, made sometime in the night. 2 men, from the spread of the prints, moving parallel to the ridgeline rather than toward the ranch, which meant they were scouting rather than approaching. Looking at the layout, counting structures, identifying where people were. He felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He went inside and told Nora. She put her coffee down and stood up without wasting time on reaction. Today? She said. Not today. They're still reading the ground. But tomorrow, maybe. Day after at the outside. She looked toward the loft where Elsie still slept. The same look she'd had on her face in the Millhaven hotel room, that careful, terrible composure of someone managing something that terrified them. She can't be in the cabin when it happens, Nora said. No. Maze. It's 4 miles. I know how far it is. She looked at him. I'll take her now, before it's light enough to be watched properly. She was already thinking through it. He could see her doing it. I come back before midday. You haven't gone to get me, which means it's not done yet. I wait at May's with Elsie until... No, he said. You stay at May's. She looked at him with a particular quality of stillness. No. Nora, I have been running from this man for 4 months, she said quietly, precisely, the kind of quiet that is the opposite of calm. I have been cold and hungry, and I've slept in barns, and I've left my daughter on a crate in a strange town to try to keep her safe, and I have been afraid every single day, and I am done being somewhere else while my life gets decided. She held his gaze. I can shoot. You know I can shoot, and this is my fight more than it's yours. He looked at her for a long moment. Stay behind cover, he said. Whatever happens, You stay behind cover and you do not go into open ground. You hear? Yes, she said. And if it goes wrong in any way that isn't recoverable, you go to Maze and you keep going. You don't stop. It's not going to go wrong. Nora? All right, she said. If it goes wrong, I go. He nodded. Wake Elsie. Get her dressed and fed, and we'll take her to Maze together before the light changes. Elsie, woken gently, was confused and then serious in the way she had, reading the room with her dark eyes. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She ate her oatmeal. When Nora braided her hair at the table, Elsie sat very straight and let her, and she held her mother's hand longer than usual at the door of May's homestead, but she went in. She turned at the door and looked at Silas. You'll be careful, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for another moment, that same full-weight attention she'd given him in the street in Grey Ridge, running whatever calculation she ran. Then she went inside. May stood in the doorway with her shotgun leaning against the frame, and her expression making it clear she was unhappy with the situation, but had made her decision about what her part in it was. I'll keep her busy, she said. She can finish the bread. Thank you, May. Go do what you're going to do, May said, and shut the door. They rode back to the ranch through the early morning, and Silas thought about Clyde Rowan the whole way. He'd been building a picture of the man from what Nora told him, the way you build a picture of terrain from a map. You know the shape of it before you see it, but you don't know everything. A man with money and the willingness to spend it, with patience enough to track someone across 400 miles of winter, with the particular cruelty that comes from believing yourself entitled. That was one kind of problem. The man named Harker, who thought that was a different and more specific kind. He needed to take Harker's thinking away from him. The trick with fighting on ground you know against people who don't is that knowing the ground is only useful if you make them fight it. If they get to stand off at a distance with rifles and pick their targets, the terrain doesn't matter. He had to give them a reason to come in close, into the angles and shadows and complications he'd been building for 5 days. He'd been thinking about the woodpile. It was stacked along the south wall of the barn, 4 feet high and 8 feet long, dry pine and cedar that had been curing since fall. Dry enough to catch fast enough to make a lot of smoke in a hurry. He didn't intend to burn his own barn. That would be a ruinous cost, even if everything else went right. But he could construct a controlled burn at the base of the pile, enough to generate the kind of dense, rolling smoke that turned open ground into uncertain ground, that made distance a liability rather than an asset, that forced people to move toward the fire to see through it rather than staying where they were comfortable. He explained this to Nora on the ride back, and she listened without interrupting, which he'd come to understand meant she was actually processing it rather than waiting for a pause to respond. And when they come in through the smoke, she said, they funnel through the gap between the barn and the cabin. There's no other way in without going around the long way, and if they go the long way, I've got the wire and the drop from the hayloft. She was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this longer than today. I've been planning since the tracks, he admitted. Before that. He didn't answer that one. They came on the afternoon of the next day. Silas heard them before he saw them. The sound of horses picking down the ridge trail, more than 2, spread out the way men spread out when they're expecting trouble. He counted by sound and got 4, maybe 5, which matched what Nora had predicted. He was in the barn loft with the rifle. Nora was in the cabin with the second rifle and a clear sight line from the window to the front approach. He watched through the loft gap as they came off the trail into the open ground before the ranch. They stopped about 100 yards out, fanning slightly, and he could see the arrangement. 2 on the left flank, 2 on the right, and 1 man sitting his horse in the center who he hadn't met but recognized anyway. The particular way some men sit when they're used to being the most important thing in the room, even outdoors. Clyde Rowan was not as large as Silas had expected. He was compact, dark-coated, with a stillness that could be mistaken for calm but wasn't. It was the stillness of compression, a coiled thing. He had the horse under easy control, which said something about his hands. He looked at the cabin and the barn and the silent ranch with the flat assessment of someone appraising property. The 5th man, positioned slightly back from the others, slightly to the right. That would be Harker. Watching the ridge lines, not the buildings. Already checking the sight lines. Already noting the hayloft. Already looking for the angles. Good instincts. That was going to be a problem. Clyde called out, "Boone," his voice carried clean in the cold air. "I know you've got my wife and my daughter in there. I've got legal papers that say they belong with me. You send them out and we ride away. And whatever you've gotten yourself into here, I'm willing to call it a misunderstanding." Silas said nothing. "I'm a patient man," Clyde called, "but I'm not a forgiving one. Send them out." Still nothing. He watched Harker speak to Clyde, quiet, too low to carry, and saw Clyde's head move in response. Harker had spotted the hayloft gap. He was advising a retreat from the direct approach. Smart, too smart. Silas touched the bundle of oiled rags he'd prepared and reached for the matches. The smoke came fast, the way dry pine smoke does. Thick and white, and rolling along the ground in the cold air, pouring out from the base of the woodpile in a churning mass that reached the space between the barn and the cabin within a minute and started moving toward the waiting horses. He heard the horses react, the sudden shifting and the high sounds that horses make when something alarms them. And through the loft gap he watched the careful formation Clyde had arranged start to come apart as the animals began to move. Harker held his horse. Silas noted that. The two men on the left flank came in fast through the smoke, which was what he'd expected. When confused, some men moved toward the confusion, thinking forward motion is the same as control. He heard them before he could see them clearly, moving through the gap between the barn and the cabin, and he moved down the loft ladder fast and was at ground level and behind the water trough before they broke through. The first man came through the smoke with his pistol out and his eyes streaming and registered Silas 2 seconds too late. Silas caught the gun arm with one hand and put the man on the ground with the other. Not clean, not pretty. There was an elbow involved that both of them would feel tomorrow. And the gun went into the snow somewhere behind the trough. The second man stopped when he heard the first go down, which was instinct, and in this case, the wrong instinct. He was still stopped when the cabin door opened and Nora put a rifle shot into the snow 6 inches from his right boot, which communicated the situation clearly enough that he put his hands up without requiring further commentary. From the other side of the barn came the sound of the wire going, the clatter and stumble of a man's progress interrupted, and then swearing that had some creativity to it. Silas left the second man standing with his hands up and went around the barn and found the man who'd tripped sprawled in the snow, pistol skidded 3 feet away, in the process of getting himself upright with the dignity of someone pretending the wire had been a voluntary decision. Silas picked up the pistol and said, "Stay down!" And the man evaluated his options and stayed down. That was 3, which left Harker and Clyde Rowan somewhere in the smoke. He heard the cabin door and turned, expecting Nora, but it was wrong. The sound was wrong, too hard. The frame shuddering with the force of someone going through it rather than opening it. And then he heard Nora's voice from inside the cabin, sharp and controlled, and then Clyde's voice over it, and he was already moving. Harker stepped out from the corner of the barn and put himself directly in Silas's path, with a pistol leveled and the expression of a man who had been in worse situations and was not impressed by this one. "Don't," he said. One word, flat, professional. Silas stopped. "Clyde'll talk to his wife," Harker said. "That's all he wants. You let that happen, this is done." "That's not what's happening in there," Silas said. "You don't know. I know what a door sounds like when someone forces it." Harker's jaw tightened slightly. Not a reaction of conscience, more the reaction of someone revising a calculation. "Stay where you are," he said. "I can't do that." Harker cocked the pistol. The sound of it was small and mechanical and absolute in the cold air. "I'm telling you to stay where you are." From inside the cabin came a crash, something heavy going over, the table maybe, and Nora's voice, no longer controlled, sharp and immediate and furious, and Clyde's voice raised over it. Silas looked at the gun and at the man holding it and at the distance between them, which was 12 feet, and he did a calculation that a smarter man might have reached a different conclusion from. "You're going to have to use that," Silas said, "or get out of my way." Harker held the aim for another half second. Then something shifted in his face, the recalculation completing itself, arriving somewhere unexpected, and he lowered the pistol slightly, not all the way, but enough. "Hell," Harker said, with the tone of a man irritated with himself, and stepped aside. Silas went through the cabin door. Clyde Rowan had Nora backed against the far wall with one hand on her shoulder and the other holding a fold of papers that he was trying to put in her face. The legal documents, presumably, the instrument he'd been using as a weapon from a distance and was now trying to use up close. The table was on its side between them and the door, knocked over in whatever had happened in the first seconds. Nora had both hands against his chest, not striking, holding ground, her jaw set and her eyes furious. Clyde turned when the door opened. He saw Silas and he straightened and released Nora's shoulder with the particular deliberateness of a man establishing that he's choosing to do so rather than being forced. And he looked at Silas with the assessment that was his default expression, and he said, "This is between me and my wife." "No," Silas said, "it's not. I have legal documents. I see them." "Then you understand the situation. I understand that you tracked your wife and your daughter 400 miles in a December winter and hired men to help you drag them back." Silas kept his voice even. "I understand that a woman doesn't run 400 miles in December for no reason." Clyde's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did, something that had been performance dropped for a moment into something older and meaner and more honest. What goes on between a man and his wife is no one else's business. It became my business when you sent someone to take a 4-year-old off the street. That's my daughter. She's a child, Silas said. She sat on a crate in the snow for 3 days, 4 years old. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She was just waiting because her mother told her someone would come back and she believed it. He paused. What does a child have to go through before she stops believing the people who are supposed to take care of her? You tell me. You seem to know the answer. Something moved through Clyde Rowan's face. He didn't like what he was hearing, not because it wounded him, but because it named something accurately that he preferred unnamed. Get out of my way, Clyde said. No! The first punch came fast. Clyde was quick, quicker than his compact stillness suggested, and it landed on the left side of Silas's jaw and rattled his back teeth and sent him sideways into the doorframe. He took the impact and stayed up and straightened, and Clyde came in again with a follow shot that he'd been expecting and slipped enough that it took him on the shoulder instead of the chin. What happened after that was not impressive by any measure. It was a small cabin with a toppled table taking up most of the floor, 2 men who both knew what they were doing in a limited and ugly way, and Nora flat against the far wall because there was nowhere else to go. Silas took 2 more hits that he would feel for a week and gave back 3 that connected with varying effectiveness. And the thing that ended it wasn't skill or strategy, but the point at which Clyde Rowan stepped back onto the edge of the overturned table, and the table moved under him and he went down badly, his shoulder taking the floor and his arm going at an angle that made a sound no arm was supposed to make. He went still. The room was quiet except for the sound of breathing and the fire still burning in the hearth, indifferent. Silas stood with his hand braced on the wall and waited for his vision to settle. His jaw felt like it had been rearranged, which was possible. He looked at Clyde on the floor, who was conscious and very white in the face and holding his arm at the careful non-movement of something that hurt badly. Nora hadn't moved from the wall. She was looking at her husband on the floor with an expression that was many things, and none of them were the ones he might have expected. Not triumph, not relief, not exactly. Something more complicated and quieter than either. Harker appeared in the doorway. He looked at Clyde on the floor and at Silas against the wall and at the toppled table. He looked at the general geometry of the situation. Then he looked at the papers that had scattered across the floor when Clyde went down. The legal documents, face up, lying on the rough boards. I need you to understand something, Harker said. He was talking to Silas, but he was looking at the papers. I was hired for protection work. I was told the situation. A pause. I was told a version of the situation. What version were you told? Silas said. A version that didn't include a child left out in the cold for 3 days. He looked at Clyde. Sir, I'll get you to a doctor. After that, my employment is concluded. Clyde said something that was probably an objection, but the arm was making concentration difficult. Silas bent down and gathered the papers from the floor. He wasn't a lawyer and couldn't read half of what they said, but he could read enough. Could see the language about desertion, about property, about legal right of return, and he held them and looked at Harker. Aldridge, he said, in town. He's been building a counter record. These go to him. Harker looked at him. Those are private legal documents. They were on my floor. He held the man's gaze. You're changing employment anyway. A long pause. Then Harker nodded, once. Get your man to the doctor, Silas said. The others, same. Then I'd recommend all of you put a lot of distance between yourselves and this county. He got no argument. The clearing out took the better part of an hour. The hired men collected from around the property with varying degrees of cooperation. Clyde gotten onto a horse with Harker's assistance. The retreat down the eastern trail watched from the barn loft to confirm it was actually a retreat and not a repositioning. Silas watched until he couldn't hear them anymore, and then he stood in the cold for a few more minutes anyway, because certainty was worth the discomfort. When he came back inside, Nora had righted the table and was sitting at it with her hands around a cup of coffee that she'd somehow managed to make in the intervening time, which told him something about her character that he already knew but kept finding new evidence for. She looked at his jaw. How bad? Manageable. He touched it and amended this to, probably manageable. She stood up and went to the water basin and came back with a cloth, cold and wrung out, and she put it against his jaw without asking permission. He sat still for it. The papers, she said. Aldridge has them. Or will. He looked at her. He'll find angles in them that we can't see. Problems with jurisdiction, with the filing, with the standard of evidence. He told me to bring him everything. You think it's enough? I think it changes the shape of what Clyde Rowan is facing. Right now, he's got a wife who ran and a man who interfered. After Aldridge, he's got a record that tells a different story. He paused. It's not clean. Nothing about this is clean, but clean is not usually what's available. She held the cloth against his jaw and looked at him with those steady eyes, and for a moment the cabin was very quiet. The fire, the wind at the window, the sound of both of them breathing. He'll be back, she said. Maybe not this winter, but eventually. Maybe, Silas said, or maybe what happened today is enough to make the cost not worth it. He met her gaze. Men like that mostly run the same calculation you do. They want what they want, but not more than they want to avoid consequences. Today had some consequences. Nora's expression was not quite convinced, and he respected that, because unconvinced was honest, and it would be dishonest to promise her certainty he didn't have. We need to go get Elsie, she said. We do. She took the cloth away and looked at his jaw critically, and apparently decided it would survive, and she set the cloth on the table and went for her coat. He watched her move through the cabin, a woman who had been running for 4 months, who had gone through things that would have hollowed out most people, who was still here and still standing and had faced down her husband against a wall with her jaw set and her hands out and hadn't broken. He thought about what Aldridge had said. Too often the law gets used as the harm itself. And he thought about the papers now in his coat pocket. Clyde Rowan's instruments of legal violence removed from the field. Not finished. Nothing this complicated finished in one afternoon. But shifted. The weight of it redistributed, shared out differently than it had been when it was Nora alone carrying it down 400 miles of frozen road. She came back with her coat on and looked at him. Ready? He stood up. His jaw hurt, and his shoulder had a bruise developing that he could already feel, and there was a cut on his knuckle he'd apparently gotten sometime during the fight without noticing, and the ranch would need work, and there was still wood to bring in, and the milk cow had been neglected all day and would have opinions about it. Ready, he said. They went out into the cold together, the smoke from the smothered woodpile still drifting low across the snow, the winter afternoon going gold and dim around the ranch, the mountains standing as they always stood, permanent, indifferent, present regardless of what happened at their feet. He got the horses from the barn, and they rode toward Mays, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. And the snow under the horses' hooves made the soft, compacted sound of a world that had been through something and was still going. Elsie saw the bruise before she saw anything else. She was standing in May's doorway when they rode up, May behind her with one hand on the girl's shoulder in a way that suggested Elsie had been difficult to contain for the last few hours. And the moment Silas dismounted, Elsie came off the step and crossed the yard at speed and stopped directly in front of him and looked at his jaw with an expression that was somewhere between alarm and accusation. You said you'd be careful, she said. I was. he said. The other man looks worse. She studied the bruise with the focused displeasure of someone conducting an inspection. Then she reached up and put her small hand very lightly against his cheek, not on the bruise, beside it, and looked at him with those serious eyes, and he felt that shift again. The one that had started in the street in Grey Ridge, that kept happening in the same place, somewhere behind his sternum, the ice going. Does it hurt? She said. Some. Oh, May has arnica, she said, with the authority of someone who had acquired this information and intended to deploy it. She put it on my knee when I fell. Then we'll ask May for some arnica. Elsie nodded, satisfied, and then turned and went to her mother, and Nora caught her and held her. And Silas led the horses to May's small barn and gave them water and stood there for a moment in the animal warmth and the smell of hay and let the day settle into its proper weight. His jaw hurt. His shoulder hurt worse. His right hand had a cut that had stiffened in the cold and would need cleaning properly before it decided to become a problem. He was aware of all of it at a careful distance, the way you're aware of damage when the situation is still active and your body is still prioritizing function over sensation. Now the situation wasn't active anymore, and the damage was becoming more present, arriving in waves that he managed by standing still and breathing evenly and looking at the horses, which were uncomplicated and needed nothing from him right now except the water he'd already given them. He thought about Clyde Rowan on the floor of the cabin, holding his arm with that white-faced stillness. He thought about Harker in the doorway, looking at the scattered papers. He thought about what was resolved and what wasn't, because those were different categories, and it was important not to confuse them. What was resolved? The immediate threat. Clyde and his men had left the property. The dynamic of the last 4 months, Nora running, Clyde following, had broken, at least for now, because Clyde had come to Grey Ridge to use his papers as a battering ram, and instead he'd ended up on the floor with a shoulder that wouldn't work right for weeks, and his instruments were in Aldridge's hands, and his hired men had quit, and whatever calculation he'd been running would need to be rebuilt from a different starting position. What wasn't resolved? Anything legal. Aldridge would work with what he had, and Silas trusted the man's instincts, but a counter-record was not a verdict. And Clyde Rowan still had money and connections in Dunmore, and presumably the anger of a man who did not accept the words, "This is done easily." There would be more moves. They would be slower, more careful, routed through courts rather than hired hands, and that made them harder to see coming. But that was the long game, and the long game had to be played one day at a time. He went back to May's cabin, and May cleaned his hand without ceremony, tutting at the cut in the specific disapproving register she used for things she considered avoidable. And Elsie stood beside him the entire time, monitoring the procedure with professional attention and occasionally handing May things she didn't ask for, but sometimes used anyway. Nora sat across the table and drank tea and watched the three of them, and he caught her expression once. Something open and unguarded that she didn't have time to arrange before he saw it. Something that looked like a woman watching a thing she hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet what to do with. She looked away. He did too. They stayed the night at May's because riding back in the dark with a child and 2 horses and a collection of injuries wasn't the right choice. And May produced this arrangement as a fait accompli by simply setting 4 bowls on the table for supper. Nobody argued. You didn't argue with May when she'd decided something. Over supper, Elsie talked about the bread she'd made, which May had apparently allowed her to shape, resulting in a loaf that was somewhat irregular but real, and which sat on the counter as evidence. She described the shaping process in detail that probably exceeded the room's interest but received respectful attention from all quarters. Silas ate his soup and felt the arnica working on his jaw, and watched Nora watch her daughter with that private expression she had when she thought nobody was looking. Not quite relief, not quite joy. Something more complicated, something that had fear still in it, because 4 months of being afraid doesn't dissolve in one afternoon, even when the immediate source of it has retreated. He understood that. He didn't say anything about it. Understanding a thing and being able to help with it were different capabilities, and he knew his limits. After the meal, May told Elsie she could sleep in the bedroom, which was May's room, and Elsie accepted this with the dignity of a visiting head of state and took herself and her canvas sack through the door. May followed to get her settled, and Silas and Nora sat at the table in the lamplit kitchen with the remains of supper between them. "What did Aldridge say exactly?" Nora said. "When you talked to him about the papers." "I haven't talked to him yet. I've got the papers. We go in the morning. She nodded, turning her cup in her hands. What are the chances? He thought about how honest to be and decided that full honesty was what she could handle and what she deserved. Aldridge is good. The papers have problems. I could see a few just from reading them, and I don't know legal documents. The jurisdiction is questionable because the original filing was in Dunmore, and you've been in 4 other counties since. And Clyde's case rests on desertion, which gets complicated the moment there's a record of what you were deserting from. He paused. The chances aren't certain. Nothing about this kind of thing is certain, but they're real. She was quiet for a moment. Parker took him to a doctor. Yes. His shoulder. Yes. She looked at the table. I'm not sorry about that, she said simply. Not vindictive, just true. I know. Another silence. The lamp threw warm light across her face, catching the fading yellow-green of the bruise on her jaw, and she looked tired in a deep way, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch right away, that requires more than one night to start moving. I need to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. Why are we at your ranch? She looked up. Why are we still there? You picked Elsie up because she needed someone. You came and found me because she needed me and I needed finding. But that was the emergency, and the emergency is over, and we are still. She gestured vaguely. In your house. He looked at her. Where else would you go? That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He set his coffee down. I don't have a clean answer. I know you need somewhere to be while Aldridge works, and the ranch is the most defensible location in the county, and Elsie knows where things are in the cabin now, and she likes Harlan. He paused. Those are the practical reasons. And the other kind? He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who found this kind of conversation easy, not because he lacked the feelings that required the words, but because the words had gotten out of practice and came back slow when he called on them. I'm not sure yet what the other kind is, he said, which was more honest than eloquent, but was what he had. Nora looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded once, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who has received an honest answer and is treating it as such. All right, she said. All right, he said. They went back to the ranch the next morning, and for the next 3 weeks, while January wore down into February and the worst of the winter began its first slow yielding to something less absolute, they lived in the cabin together and rebuilt what the siege had damaged and made the necessary arrangements with Aldridge and did the daily work of the ranch, which didn't stop for any of it. The woodpile had to be rebuilt, which took 3 days and most of Silas's usable timber stock, with more needing to be cut from the stands on the north ridge. He did this with an axe and a sled and Harlan's patient cooperation, and on the second day Nora showed up at the tree line with her own axe, which she'd found in the lean-to and sharpened without asking, and she worked the other side of the designated trees with a technique that was competent and efficient and made clear that she'd done this before. He didn't comment on this, which she seemed to appreciate. The barn roof needed the work she'd done to it properly finished, which they did together on a day when the wind was down and the cold was dry rather than cutting. Silas worked from the top. Nora handed material from the ladder, and they developed over the course of the morning a shorthand that didn't require much talking. She anticipated what he needed with the accuracy of someone who'd watched the work being done and understood it, and he handed things down when her hands appeared at the roofline without needing to look to know she was ready. Elsie spent these days in an orbit between wherever Silas was working and wherever Nora was, with periodic returns to the cabin to check on the fire. She'd adopted the fire as her responsibility without being assigned it, and she maintained it with the same proprietary seriousness she brought to everything, adding wood when it needed it, adjusting the draft with the lever that controlled the flue with the air of an expert. She'd also started talking to Harlan, which Silas had noticed and found both practical. Harlan was old and patient and a good audience. And quietly something else, some evidence of a child putting down small roots, establishing relationships with the specific places and creatures of a specific location in the way that children do when they feel safe enough to do it. He was careful not to read too much into it. He was careful about a lot of things. Aldridge was moving. He sent word twice in the first 2 weeks, brief notes that Beller's boy delivered on his daily run. The first said the jurisdiction question was promising and he was filing a preliminary challenge in the territorial court. The second said he'd found a discrepancy in the original Dunmore filing that he was pursuing. Neither of these meant victory, but they meant the legal ground was not as solid under Clyde Rowan's feet as Clyde Rowan had believed, and that changed the available positions. Silas told Nora what the note said. She received the information steadily, filed it, went back to whatever she'd been doing. She was like that. She processed things internally and completely and didn't need to narrate the processing, which he found restful without knowing why until he thought about it, and understood that it was because most situations didn't require that he manage anything except the situation itself. What he didn't expect was the gradual way the cabin changed, not dramatically. No single morning he woke up and found it transformed. It was accumulative, the way weather accumulates. Small things layering on small things until the total was something different from the starting point. Nora had reorganized the kitchen shelf in a way that made more functional sense, and that he'd rearranged back initially out of habit before realizing her arrangement was better, and rearranging it back to hers. There was a piece of cloth tacked across the window in the loft where Elsie slept, a scrap of blue wool that Nora had found in the supply box and hemmed by hand. Not curtain exactly, more like a signal that the space was occupied by someone who was staying. There was a drawing on the wall beside the hearth. He didn't know when Elsie had put it there. It was done in charcoal on a piece of brown paper, rough but legible. 3 figures, 1 large, 2 smaller, standing in a line in what was identifiably a yard with a fence shape behind them, and a triangle roof suggesting a cabin. The large figure had marks suggesting a hat. One of the smaller figures had what might have been mittens. Elsie had not labeled it, but she had signed her name in the bottom corner in the deliberate printing of a child who was proud of her letters. He stood and looked at it for a long time one morning when he was alone in the cabin. He did not take it down. The evenings were the hardest part to navigate, not hard in a bad way, in the way of something unfamiliar that required attention, that he didn't have established habits for. After supper, after Elsie was in the loft, he and Nora sat by the fire in the 2 chairs, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both states were comfortable in a way that was itself uncomfortable, because comfortable implied permanence, and permanence was a thing he'd long since stopped assuming was available to him. She'd begun telling him things, not in a rush, not confessionally, more like a woman setting down objects from a bag she'd been carrying, one at a time, in no particular order. He learned that she'd grown up in a farming county in the Eastern Territories, the second of 4 children, that her mother had died when she was 12 and she'd largely raised her 2 younger siblings herself, that she'd married Clyde Rowan at 19 because he'd seemed like safety, steady work, a house, a man who at the time had been capable of the performance of kindness, and that the performance had stopped approximately 18 months in when he'd decided it was no longer required. She didn't dramatize any of this. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, looking at the fire, or at her hands, or sometimes at him. He listened without offering commentary or reassurance, which he suspected was what she needed. Not responses, just reception, a place to put things that had been carried alone for a long time. He told her things too, in the same gradual and unplanned way. He'd grown up in the eastern part of the territory, like her, though farther north. His father had died when he was young, thrown from a horse on a morning so ordinary that Silas had never fully trusted ordinary mornings after. He'd worked cattle for other men for 15 years before saving enough to buy land, and the land he'd bought was this land, which he'd chosen because the bowl between the ridgelines reminded him of nowhere he'd ever been, which felt like a good reason. He did not tell her about the years in between that he wasn't proud of. Not yet. Some things required more trust than 3 weeks, and he knew it, and he thought she understood without needing to say so. One evening in early February, Elsie came back down from the loft when she was supposed to be asleep. This was not unprecedented. She did it occasionally, usually claiming thirst in a way that everyone understood was not primarily about water. But this time she didn't ask for water. She came and stood by Silas's chair and looked at him with the directness she always had, and she said, "Are you going to stay?" He looked at her. Nora was very still in the chair across from him. "I live here," he said. "This is my ranch." "That's not what I'm asking," Elsie said, with the patient precision of a child who knows when an adult is answering the wrong question. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking?" She seemed to think about how to phrase it. "When things are done," she said, "are you going to stay with us? Or are we going somewhere else?" The fire popped. Outside, the wind was the low register it dropped to on still nights, present but not demanding. He looked at her, and then at Nora, who was looking at the fire with the expression she used when she was working something out and didn't want it to show, and it showed anyway. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I don't want you to go somewhere else." Elsie considered this. She was 4, and she was also, in some ways he was still discovering, older than 4, and she took the answer and weighed it seriously. "Okay," she said. "That's honest." "It is." She nodded. "Good night," she said formally to both of them, and went back up the ladder. Silas sat with the fire for a moment without looking at Nora. Then he looked at Nora. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have—" "No," she said. "Don't apologize for it." She was looking at her hands folded in her lap. She asks things the rest of us don't have the nerve to. He didn't answer, because there was no answer that didn't require going somewhere he wasn't ready to go with words yet. But the question hung in the warm air of the cabin, Elsie's question, honest and clear, and neither of them moved to take it down. March came in cold and then shifted. It happened over the course of a single week, the kind of shift that the territory did sometimes, abrupt and total, as if winter had simply decided it was done and stepped back from the field. The snow on the south-facing slopes went first, revealing the brown ground underneath like something peeled back. And then the ice on the water trough stopped reforming overnight. And then one morning, Silas woke to the sound of meltwater running from the barn roof and lay there listening to it for a while before getting up. He found Elsie already awake and already at the window, watching the drips fall from the eaves with the focused wonder of a child seeing something new, though she must have seen spring before. Maybe not like this, in a place that felt like hers. "It's melting," she told him, as if this were information he needed. "I see that." "Does the snow go all the way away?" "By April, mostly." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "And then what?" "Then the ground thaws. Things start growing." He put the coffee on. "The horses like it better." "Does Harlan like it?" "Harlan likes most things," he said. "He's a reasonable horse." She turned from the window and looked at him with a particular expression, one he'd started to be able to read, a sort of calculation she ran before asking something she wasn't sure about. "Can I name one of the other horses?" "What's wrong with their names?" "Buck and Pepper," she said with diplomatic reservation. "Those are fine names." She gave him a look that communicated without words the limits of her agreement. He almost smiled. "We'll talk about it," he said. "That means yes," she said, and went to get her boots. Aldridge's word came in the second week of March. Not a note this time, but the man himself, who rode out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon and tied his horse at the rail and came in and sat down at the table with the slight breathlessness of a man who had been carrying something good and was now ready to put it down. "The Dunmore filing has been formally challenged," he said. "The territorial judge reviewed it and found 3 procedural deficiencies, which don't void it automatically, but severely weaken its force. More importantly, I have sworn affidavits from 2 witnesses in Dunmore, a neighbor and a physician who treated Mrs. Rowan on 2 separate occasions, documenting the basis for her departure." He laid the papers on the table. "Combined with the discrepancy in the marriage documentation, which pertains to the age recorded at the time of the ceremony and has some implications for the original validity, Clyde Rowan's legal position is considerably worse than he represented it." Nora sat across the table and looked at the papers. Her face was very still. "What does that mean, practically?" It means that pursuing custody through the courts has become an expensive and uncertain proposition for him, with a documented counter-record now in place that any judge will have to weigh. Aldridge pushed his glasses up. "It doesn't mean he can't try. It means the costs are high and the outcome is uncertain. Men like this usually recalculate when the math changes." "He might not recalculate," Nora said. "He might not," Aldridge agreed. "But if he comes back to this county, I have enough on record to pursue a formal harassment complaint in the territorial court, and the judge has already indicated he's paying attention to this case. That has weight." He looked at her steadily. "You're not invisible anymore, Mrs. Rowan. You have a record. That changes what he can do." She looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she picked them up, one at a time, and she read them with the careful thoroughness she brought to everything, and when she was done, she set them down and sat with her hands flat on the table. "Thank you," she said. The 2 words were simple, and she didn't embellish them, which was the right call. Aldridge nodded once and accepted them the same way. After he left, the ranch was very quiet. Elsie had gone to the barn to visit Harlan, a routine she'd established firmly enough that Harlan now looked for her at particular times of day with what Silas could only describe as expectation. Silas stood at the kitchen window and watched Aldridge's horse make its way back up the eastern trail and felt something in his chest that he didn't immediately identify. A lightening that was different from relief. Something more like a room that had been closed for a long time being opened. Nora came and stood beside him at the window. Not close, but close enough that he was aware of her there. The specific presence of her. Distinct. "It's not over," she said. "No. But it's different." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what Elsie asked you." He turned to look at her. She kept looking out the window, at the trail, at the mountains going brown and gray at their lower edges as the snow retreated. "She asked it because she needed to know," Nora said. "And She stopped, started again. "I need to know too, not because I'm making demands, because I need to know what I'm planning for, what she's planning for." "What are you planning for?" he said. She turned and looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said, which was his own answer returned to him, and he heard it land the same way he'd offered it. Not evasion, just truth. "But I know what I want it to look like." A pause. "I want it to look like this. What we've been doing, the work, and the evenings, and the fire." She held his gaze. "I haven't wanted anything in 4 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself." He stood with that for a moment. He was aware of how easy it would be to say the wrong thing here. Too much or too little, too fast or too defended. And so he said what was true without ornamentation. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I'm quiet in ways that aren't always comfortable, and I forget to say things I should say, and I've got history I haven't told you yet." "I know," she said. "You're not the only one." "I know that too." She looked at him. "So?" "So," he said. "I think we keep doing what we've been doing, and we see what it becomes." It was not a declaration. It was not romantic by the measure of most things called romantic. It was two people who had both been through enough to know that grand statements were not the same as durable intentions, standing in a kitchen in early March with the sound of meltwater off the barn roof and a child's drawing on the wall by the hearth, agreeing to something that didn't have a clean name yet. She nodded. Something in her shoulders changed, a tension he'd been seeing for so long he'd stopped noticing it until it shifted. "I'll start supper," she said. "I'll get Elsie from the barn," he said. He went out into the March afternoon, the air cold, but with something underneath the cold that was new, a softness, a suggestion, the season not yet arrived, but approaching. The barn door was open, and he could hear Elsie's voice inside, the running, one-sided conversation she had with Harlan, telling him something about bread. He stood in the doorway. Elsie had her forehead against the horse's nose, one hand on his jaw, and she was talking in the low, confiding voice she used with him. And Harlan was doing what he always did, standing still and paying attention with the patience of an animal that had long since made peace with the world. She hadn't noticed Silas in the doorway. He watched them for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming through the gaps in the barn boards and the long horizontal shafts that it made in this season, catching the dust and the horse's breath and Elsie's hair where it had come loose from its braid. She was gesturing slightly with one hand as she talked, the other still against Harlan's jaw, and she was so entirely at home in this barn, in this light, in this specific place, that the sight of her did the thing to his chest that Elsie reliably did to his chest, that he'd stopped trying to armor against. He thought about a crate in the snow, about a child sitting still in the cold, waiting. She'd asked him to pretend to be her father until her mama came back. He'd said he would. And then her mama had come back. And the thing he'd agreed to pretend had turned into something he no longer had to pretend at all. It had shifted under him, the way the ice shifts in late winter. And he'd gone from standing on the surface of something to standing in it, inside it, without a single moment he could point to and say there, that was when it changed. That was when he changed. "Elsie," he said. She turned. Her face did the thing it did when she saw him. Not a big reaction, not a performance, just a settling. The same thing Nora's shoulders did, the same thing he suspected his own face did, and was probably not successfully concealing. Supper time? She said. Just about. She gave Harlan a final pat on the nose. I'll be back tomorrow, she told the horse, with the certainty of someone who has decided this is a fact rather than a plan. She came to the doorway and took hold of his hand, not the two-finger grip from the street in Grey Ridge, but his whole hand, her small one wrapped around it. And they walked back toward the cabin together through the March afternoon, through the melting snow and the long light, toward the window where Nora was visible moving in the kitchen, toward the smoke coming from both chimneys, toward the drawing on the wall and the blue cloth in the loft window, and the fire that Elsie maintained like it was hers because it was. The ranch was quiet around them. The mountains stood where they always stood. The ground was thawing, and things were beginning underground that would be visible in another few weeks. The tentative and stubborn beginning of things that had survived the winter by going deep and waiting. He held her hand and they walked home. The last of the snow left the south pasture on a Thursday in late March, retreating to the north-facing hollows where it would hold another week or two before giving up entirely, and Silas found himself standing at the fence line that morning, looking at the exposed ground with the particular feeling that comes at the end of a long winter. Not celebration, just a quiet reckoning, the body registering that something hard had concluded. He'd been out since first light, walking the fence line to check for winter damage, the kind of work that didn't demand much from the mind and left it free to move where it wanted. His jaw had healed. His shoulder had healed. His hand had healed cleanest of all, which May had attributed to her poultice and which he hadn't disputed because there was no upside to disputing May about medical matters. What hadn't fully healed, or more accurately what had healed into something different from what it had been, was the shape of his life. He stood at the fence and looked at the muddy pasture and thought about the word permanent, which he had not applied to anything in his life for a long time, which he had in fact stopped trusting sometime in his late 20s as a defense against the particular grief of losing things. You didn't mourn what you'd never counted on. It was a functional philosophy. It had gotten him through a lot of bad winters, literal and otherwise. The problem was that somewhere between December and March, between a child on a crate and a drawing on the wall and a woman reorganizing his kitchen shelf in a way that was objectively better, he had started counting on things again. Not consciously, not with permission. It had happened the way the thaw happened, incremental, underground, invisible until it was already done. He heard the cabin door and turned. Elsie came across the yard in her boots, which fit now because Nora had taken her into Grey Ridge 2 weeks ago and bought proper ones, and she had a biscuit in each hand, which was her standard morning delivery system. Nora made extras, she announced, and held one out to him. He took it. Thank you. She climbed up onto the lowest fence rail and ate her biscuit, looking out at the pasture with the proprietary satisfaction she'd extended from the cabin to include the entire ranch over the last weeks. She'd named the horse. The horse was now called Edmund, which was a name she'd heard somewhere and liked the sound of, and which May had called ridiculous and which had stuck anyway because Elsie was immovable on the subject. The mud's going to be bad this week, Silas said. May says mud in March means good grass in May, Elsie said. May's right about that. Elsie chewed her biscuit. Is May always right? He thought about this honestly. About most things. What's she wrong about? She thinks Edmund is a ridiculous name for a horse. Elsie nodded with the serenity of someone whose position on the matter was too secure to require defense. She finished her biscuit and licked her fingers and looked at him sideways. Are you nervous? He looked at her. About what? Today, she said, as if it were obvious, which possibly to her it was. He hadn't told her anything specific about today. He looked at her, and she looked back with those eyes that had been reading him since December, and apparently reading him accurately. And he understood that Elsie Rowan was 4 years old, and also, in certain respects, a force of nature that no amount of adult discretion could successfully contain. Did your mother say something? He said. No, she said, with the careful precision of someone being technically truthful. But I heard you talking. Elsie. I wasn't trying to, she said. The loft has gaps. He had been aware the loft had gaps. He had not fully accounted for what that meant in practical terms. He made a note to account for it going forward and then set it aside because going forward was exactly what today was about. Are you? She asked again. Nervous. He looked out at the muddy pasture and decided to give her the same answer he'd given her in December, because it had been the right one then, and it was the right one now. "A little," he said. "Being a little nervous means it matters." She nodded slowly, satisfied with this, and climbed down off the fence rail. "I'm going to wear my blue dress," she announced, "the one with the white buttons." "That sounds right," he said. She went back across the yard with the confidence of someone who had a plan and was executing it, and he watched her go and felt that thing in his chest that he'd stopped trying to name because it didn't need a name, it just needed to be there. And it was. He finished the fence line and came back in and washed and changed his shirt, which was the one clean one, dark blue, that he'd bought in Grey Ridge 2 weeks ago for no reason he'd admitted to at the time. Nora was at the stove with her back to him when he came in, and she turned when she heard the door and looked at him, and then looked at the shirt, and the corner of her mouth moved. "New shirt," she said. "Old shirt," he said. "Just not worn much." She turned back to the stove. They had breakfast, the three of them, and Nora was quieter than usual. Not the kind of quiet that meant something was wrong, but the kind that meant she was inside herself, moving through something. He didn't disturb it. Elsie talked enough for the table, describing to both of them at length her vision for what Edmund's new brushing schedule should look like, which involved more frequency than Edmund was probably requesting, but which Edmund would receive anyway because that was how it worked with Elsie. After breakfast, when Elsie had gone back to the loft to put on her blue dress with the white buttons, Nora stood at the basin washing the bowls, and Silas stood behind her, not close, just present, and he said, "We don't have to do it today." She kept washing. "I know. If you need more time, Silas." She set the bowl down and turned around and leaned against the basin and looked at him with the directness she had, the kind that came from a woman who had been through enough to know that waiting for the perfect conditions was how you waited forever. "I have been frightened of the wrong things for a long time. I've been frightened of him finding us, and of the law, and of not having anywhere to go." She paused. "I'm not frightened of this." "Okay," he said. "Are you?" "A little," he said, for the third time that morning. She studied him. "Good," she said. "It means it matters." She turned back to the dishes, and he stood there for a moment with the understanding that Elsie Rowan came by her particular quality of precision honestly, from her mother's side, and then he got his coat and went out to hitch the wagon. The ride into Grey Ridge took 40 minutes on the spring roads, which were soft in the low sections and better on the high ground, and they went through it with Elsie between them on the wagon seat, pointing out things she'd decided to point out: a hawk on a fence post, the state of the ice on the creek they crossed, a tree that had come down over the winter and whose root ball was sticking up at an angle she found interesting. She was wearing her blue dress with a coat over it, and her good boots, and her hair was braided with a piece of blue ribbon Nora had found in her bag, and she kept touching the ribbon as if making sure it was still there. Grey Ridge was not a large town. Silas had said this to himself many times as a neutral fact. Today he noticed it differently. Noticed the scale of it, the way everyone's business was available to everyone else, whether they offered it or not. The way a wagon coming down Main Street in late March was noted from windows and doorways with the low-level interest of people for whom new things were notable. He noticed the noticing, and he kept his eyes on the road, and he thought about what kind of man does a thing because it's right and does it in front of the people who previously demonstrated their indifference to a child on a crate. There was something in that, not revenge, nothing as clean as that. More like a statement made by the fact of the thing itself. This is what happened. This is what people did and didn't do, and what that led to. Aldridge's office was their first stop. The lawyer was at his desk, buried in his usual archaeology of paper, and he looked up when they came in and pushed his glasses up and looked at the three of them and said, "Good morning," with the tone of a man who had expected this particular morning and was prepared for it. Nora sat across from him and went through the final papers, the ones that Aldridge had filed with the territorial court 3 weeks ago and that had come back with the stamp that changed everything. The formal recording of the challenge to the Dunmore marriage documentation, which had revealed that Clyde Rowan had understated Nora's age at the time of the ceremony by 2 years, a discrepancy small enough to be argued as clerical error, but large enough, combined with everything else, to make the original filing deeply problematic. The affidavits from the Dunmore witnesses, The territorial judge's notation that further action from the Rowan party would be reviewed in the context of the full record. Not an annulment. That was a slower process, a different filing, something Aldridge was building toward through a different court. But what they had was enough. Enough to stand on. Enough to make it clear to any court that heard Clyde Rowan's complaint that the complaint would not be uncontested, would not be simple, would cost more than it returned. Any word from him? Silas asked. Aldridge set his pen down. His lawyer contacted me last week, asked about the basis of the documentation challenge. I explained it to him. A pause. I had the impression the conversation was useful for clarifying the situation. Nora looked at him. He's not going to let it go entirely. No, probably not. Men like this find some piece of it to hold on to. Aldridge looked at her steadily. But the instrument is damaged. Whatever he holds on to, it's not the weapon he came here with. He picked up one set of papers and slid them across the desk. These are yours. Keep them. If anything changes, you contact me. She picked up the papers and looked at them for a moment. Really looked at them, the way she'd looked at the papers after the siege, like someone reading the difference between one version of their life and another. Thank you, she said. Same 2 words as before. Same weight. Aldridge nodded. Then he looked at Silas and then at Elsie, who had been sitting with her hands in her lap with the patience of someone who had been told this part was necessary before the other part could happen. And he said, "Is there something else I can do for you today, Mr. Boone?" Silas reached into his coat pocket and put another document on the desk. "There is," he said. Aldridge looked at it. Then he looked at Silas and at Nora, who was looking at Silas with an expression he couldn't fully read, except that it was open in the way she wasn't always open, unguarded, something waiting. "Well," Aldridge said, "I can do that." He pushed his glasses up. "Mabel Granger's been saying she thought this was coming since January. I'll let her know she was right, which she'll enjoy." Silas had not thought he particularly cared what Mabel Granger or anyone else in Grey Ridge thought. He found, sitting in that chair, that he cared somewhat, which surprised him, and which he examined carefully and decided was not a bad surprise. There was something in wanting your choices to be witnessed by the people around you, something that said, "This is real, this is chosen. This is not something that happened to me, but something I am doing with whatever I have left of the capacity to do it." "What does that mean?" Elsie said. She had been listening with full attention and had apparently reached the limit of what context clues could provide. "It means," Nora said, "that I need to talk to you about something." She looked at Silas, a quick exchange, and he gave her the small nod that meant, "Yes, this one's yours." Nora turned to her daughter. "You remember what you asked Silas? In the cabin, at night, when you were supposed to be asleep?" Elsie's expression confirmed that she remembered perfectly and had been aware she was supposed to be asleep. "I asked if he was staying." "He is," Nora said, "but we need to make it official. Do you know what that means?" Elsie thought about it seriously. "Like when you sign a paper?" "Something like that." "Is he going to be my real papa?" The office was very quiet. Aldridge was looking at his pen. Silas was looking at Elsie. "He's been your real papa," Nora said, "since December. We're just going to say it in front of people." Elsie absorbed this with the concentrated processing she applied to important information. She looked at Silas. He held her gaze and didn't try to fill the silence, because Elsie deserved the silence to think in, and because whatever she decided mattered in a way that he felt in the same place he felt everything that mattered, that place behind his sternum that Elsie had been rearranging since she'd put her arms around his neck on a street in the snow. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "Will I have your name?" "If you want it." She thought about this. "Elsie Boone," she said, trying the sound of it. Then, apparently satisfied, "That's a good name." "I think so too," he said. The rest of what Aldridge needed to do required a witness and was accomplished when Beller was called up from the general store downstairs and stood in his apron with ink on his hands from a delivery manifest and signed where he was told to with the cheerful willingness of a man who enjoyed being present at things. Mabel Granger appeared as well, which no one had sent for but which no one questioned, and she stood in the doorway with her fur collar and the expression of someone who had made a prediction and was watching it come true. And when it was done, she said, "Well, about time," which was about what you'd expect from Mabel Granger. They stepped out of Aldridge's office into the March morning, and the street was doing what small-town streets do, which is to say that word had moved through it the way water moves through dry ground. And there were people on the boardwalk who had reasons to be there, and some who had invented reasons. And the general quality of attention was the alert and interested kind. Silas had thought he'd find this uncomfortable. He found, standing on the step in the pale March sunlight with Nora beside him, and Elsie holding his hand, that he didn't. There was something clarifying about it, about being seen in this town, on this street, 3 blocks from the crate where Elsie had sat for 3 days while people walked past her. He was not the type to make speeches, had nothing to announce. He just stood there on the step in his good shirt and let the fact of the thing speak for itself. May was there. He hadn't known she'd come in. She'd said nothing about it. But she was standing outside Beller's with her coat on and her pale blue eyes finding him across the street. And she gave him a single nod, the kind that contained more information per word than most people managed in a paragraph, and he nodded back. Nora put her hand through his arm. Not dramatically, just placed it there. The light and certain contact of someone who has made a decision and is inhabiting it. He felt the warmth of it through the coat. "Where do you want to eat?" she said. Practical, immediate, hers. "Wherever's hot," he said. "May's coming," Elsie announced from his other side, having apparently already coordinated this while he wasn't watching. They ate at the only proper restaurant in Grey Ridge, which was run by a woman named Clara Fitch, who had learned to cook in a city far east and somehow ended up here and made the best chicken pie in the territory. The table was too small for 4, which nobody minded, and Elsie ate until Nora told her to stop before she made herself sick, and May ate with the deliberate appreciation of someone who would not admit out loud how much she'd been looking forward to not cooking for a day. The conversation was various and unimportant. May's opinion of the spring roads, Elsie's ongoing Edmund situation, whether Clara Fitch's pie had changed since the fall, and if so, in what direction. The regular conversational currency of people who are comfortable enough with each other to talk about nothing, which is one of the things that distinguishes people who are merely polite from people who have become something to each other. Silas sat at the table and ate his pie and listened to the 3 of them argue about Edmund's name with varying degrees of investment, and he thought about what his life had looked like 7 months ago. The ranch, the feed corn, the $41, the particular solitude that had calcified over years into something he'd mistaken for preference. And he thought about what it looked like now, and he thought about the distance between those 2 things, and what had covered that distance. A child on a crate, a note in a handkerchief, a decision made in a hotel room in Millhaven when a woman opened a door looking like she'd been through things she shouldn't have had to go through, and met his eyes with the careful question, why? He hadn't had a clean answer then. He had a cleaner one now, though still not a tidy one, because tidy was not the nature of the thing. The answer was that some things announced themselves as the right thing to do in a way that was simpler than all the complicated reasons not to, and you either listened to that or you didn't, and the life you ended up with was different depending on which one you chose. He had chosen, and the choosing had kept choosing itself, one decision at a time until it had become this. A table with 4 people in it, and a pie and a horse named Edmund and a drawing on the wall at home, and a blue ribbon in a little girl's hair. Not clean, not convenient, not at all what he'd planned, because he hadn't been planning. Worth it in every particular. After lunch, they walked back to the wagon through the main street, Elsie between him and Nora, and she was holding both their hands, her right hand in Nora's, her left in Silas's. And she was walking with the specific gait of a child who is happy and knows it, and is allowing the knowledge to move through her body, a slight bounce in each step that was entirely her own. She swung their hands once, experimentally, to see if they'd swing back. They did. She swung them again, further. He looked at Nora over Elsie's head. Nora was already looking at him. She had the expression, open, clear, still complicated with everything that didn't resolve overnight, and wouldn't, but present, here, looking at him. And he held it, and she held it, and the March sun came down on all 3 of them on the main street of Grey Ridge, which was the same street where none of this had been true in December, and all of it was true now. The ride home was slower. The roads were softer in the afternoon, the mud working up through the wheel ruts, and he took it easy on the horses. Elsie fell asleep between them on the seat, her head against Nora's arm, her feet in their good boots tucked under the lap blanket, the blue ribbons still in her hair. She'd been running at full capacity since before sunrise and had simply reached empty, as children do, without ceremony or transition. Nora held her and looked at the road ahead. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly, so as not to wake Elsie. "All right." When I left Dunmore, when I packed the bag and took Elsie and walked out the door, she looked at her hands, at Elsie's hair against her arm. I didn't have a plan. I had a direction, which was away, and I had her, and I had enough money to get to the next town. That was all I had. A pause. I've thought about that walk 1,000 times. Every town we passed through, every night in a cold room, every time I looked at her and she looked at me, and I didn't know if I was doing the right thing or just making things worse. She looked up at the mountains, which were beginning to show their lower snow line receding, the dark rock emerging. I didn't know what I was walking toward. I just knew what I was walking away from. He listened. He didn't interrupt. "And then she was on a crate," Nora said. "And you were there." She turned and looked at him. "I know you say it was geography, that we were on your land and that made it your business." "I said that to simplify it." "I know you did." Her voice was quiet and not sentimental, just honest. "I'm not telling you this because I think you saved us. I don't like thinking about it that way. It makes us the people who needed saving, and I don't want Elsie to grow up thinking she's someone who needed saving." A pause. "But I want to tell you that what you did, staying on the step, crossing the street, all of it, it was the thing that made it possible to stop running, not because you fixed it, because you made it so we weren't alone in it." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved through the soft afternoon, the horses knowing the way home. "You weren't running because you were weak," he said. "I know that. She wasn't on that crate because you failed her. I know that too." Nora looked at Elsie's sleeping face. "I know that now. I didn't know it clearly in December. I was still carrying it like a failure." She shifted slightly, resettling Elsie's weight. "You did something to that. You and May and Aldridge, but mostly you. Just by not making her something to be solved, just by seeing what was actually there." He looked at the road. He thought about what she was saying, about what it actually described. A man who crossed a street because he couldn't justify not crossing it, who read a note in a firelight and made a decision he didn't fully understand yet, who tracked a woman through a December snowstorm because the alternative was going home and not being able to live inside his own conscience. He was not a hero in it. He had been selfish about some of it, had wanted the thing that was growing in the cabin more than he'd wanted to be purely selfless. He'd made mistakes. He'd been too closed with Nora for too long, too careful, holding himself back in ways that probably made things harder for her in the early weeks. He'd been imperfect and calculated and human all the way through, which was not the same as good, but was the closest thing to good that actual people managed. This was, he thought, what nobody told you about doing the right thing. It was almost never a single moment of clarity. It was a series of small daily decisions, most of them unglamorous, some of them made for mixed reasons, adding up slowly into something that looked coherent in retrospect, but had been genuinely uncertain from the inside. You didn't know, in the moment, which decisions were the ones that mattered. You only found out later by looking at where you'd ended up. He'd ended up here. "I crossed the street," he said. "That's all I did." "That's not all," she said. "It's where it started." She looked at him with the measuring look, and then passed the measuring look into something quieter and more settled. "Yes," she said. "It is." They rode the rest of the way in the silence that didn't need filling, Elsie asleep between them, the mountains going gold in the late afternoon, the road unrolling ahead of them toward the ranch in its bowl between the ridge lines. He could see the smoke from both chimneys from half a mile out, which meant the fires were still going, which was possible because he'd banked them before they left. In a week or two, he wouldn't need to bank the fires anymore. The cold was losing its grip, grudgingly, but actually, and by April the mornings would be cool rather than brutal, and the firewood would last the remainder of the season on what they had. Spring. It had been so long in coming that he'd almost stopped expecting it, which was how it always went with winters in this country. By the end, you couldn't quite remember what warmth felt like, and then it arrived, and you remembered, and that remembering was not small. He pulled the wagon through the gate and up to the barn and stopped, and Elsie woke when the wheels stopped rolling, with the immediate orientation of a child used to waking in unfamiliar conditions. She looked around, the barn, the yard, the cabin, and then at him, and then at Nora, and she sat up straight and patted the blue ribbon with both hands to check on it. "We're home," she said. 2 words. Such a simple arrangement, words he'd probably said himself 1,000 times in this specific place over the years he'd been on this land. They had never sounded the way they sounded in her mouth, matter of fact and complete. The absolute naturalness of a child saying a true thing. "We are," he said. He got down and helped Nora down and then reached up for Elsie, who came into his arms with her full weight, and then wriggled down immediately because she had things to do. Edmund to check on, the fire to assess, the general state of the ranch to account for after its half-day of independent operation. She went toward the barn with her good boots making the soft sound of a child's boots in mud, the ribbon still in her hair. Nora stood beside him watching her go. "She's going to reorganize the barn next," Nora said. "Probably," he said. "It'll be better after she does." He thought about his kitchen shelf, objectively better since Nora's reorganization, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say except that he had apparently spent the last several years ordering his life with the logic of someone who lived alone and would continue to do so. And that logic was being quietly and comprehensively replaced with a different one. And he didn't mind. He didn't mind at all. May came out to the ranch that evening. She'd ridden over without announcing herself, which was her way, arriving at the door as supper was going on the stove and accepting a bowl with the air of someone doing everyone a favor by staying. Elsie told her about the chicken pie at Clara Fitch's with such thoroughness of detail that May eventually said, "I was there, I ate the pie," which slowed Elsie only briefly. They ate, and the lamp burned, and outside the spring evening settled over Gray Ridge and the mountains and the ranch in its bowl, the cold still present but without the cruelty of January, the kind of cold that reminded you it was still winter without trying to prove anything. After supper, May sat with her coffee and looked at Silas across the table with her pale blue eyes and said, "You're going to fix that fence along the north pasture before May." "I was planning on it." "The 3rd post from the pine tree," she said. "It's been leaning since fall." "I know." "And the chicken coop roof." "May, I'm just noting it." "You've noted it." She drank her coffee. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. "You did all right," she said, which was, from May Hutter, the full equivalent of a standing ovation. "The fence or the rest of it," he said. "Both," she said, and finished her coffee and stood up and got her coat. Elsie walked her to the door and they had a brief, serious exchange on the step about Edmund's brushing schedule that May mostly listened to, and then May rode off into the early dark, and Elsie came back in and announced she was tired. This was transparently not true, but was her way of indicating she was prepared to go to bed without being told to, which he understood as consideration for the adults, the way she did that sometimes, read the room and adjusted her behavior. This child who had been alone on a crate for 3 days at 4 years old and had learned, probably too early, that adults had things they needed from each other that were separate from what they needed from her. He thought about that, about what it had cost her to learn that, about the fact that she shouldn't have had to learn it that early, that the lesson had been imposed by circumstances that were not her fault or her mother's, by a man who had understood what he was doing and chosen to do it anyway. He thought about all of it, and then he let it sit where it belonged, in the past, in the true and real and unchangeable category of things that had happened, that didn't need to be undone because they couldn't be undone, and because the attempt to spend your energy wishing them undone was the surest way to miss what was present. What was present was a child in a loft with a blue curtain she'd chosen, in a cabin where she maintained the fire, in a life that had room in it for her and for her mother, and it turned out for him. He went up the ladder to say goodnight. Elsie was in her bedroll with the canvas sack, still there, still with her, old habit, tucked beside her, and she looked up when he came through the loft opening and she said, "Silas?" "Yeah." "That's what I'm going to call you," she said, not asking, informing. He crouched in the low space. "Okay." "Not Papa," she said. "Some kids call their Papa, Papa, but I like Silas." She paused. "Is that all right?" He thought about what the word Papa would do to him, and he thought about what his name in her mouth had done to him every time she'd said it since December, and he understood that the difference between the two things was smaller than it looked from the outside. "That's all right," he said. She seemed satisfied. She settled back and pulled the blanket up. "The ribbon's going to get creased if I sleep in it," she said. "Take it out and put it on the shelf." She reached up and worked it free, careful with the bow, and set it on the small shelf he'd nailed there last week for no reason he'd named at the time. Then she lay back and looked at the low rafters. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you crossed the street." He stayed crouched in the low loft, in the dark, and looked at this child who had waited 3 days on a crate and handed him a list and built fires and named a horse, Edmund, and drawn 3 figures on brown paper and asked the questions the adults were too careful to ask, and who had, in the way of certain small people, rearranged everything she touched simply by being entirely herself. "So am I," he said. He came back down the ladder and found Nora at the table with the lamp, writing something. A letter, he thought, to someone in her family, perhaps her sister who she'd mentioned once and not followed up on. He went to the hearth and put a log on the fire and stayed there for a moment watching it catch. There are things that life teaches you, if you let it, that you cannot learn from people telling you. You learn them from the specific weight of a sleeping child against your chest on a cold ride, and from a note in a handkerchief written by someone with nowhere left to go, and from the sound of meltwater off a barn roof on the first morning the winter decides to let go. You learn them from crossing streets you could have not crossed, from reading notes you could have folded back up and left alone, from staying in chairs beside fires because you said you would, and a child believed you. The lesson is not complicated. It is in fact the oldest and most obvious of lessons, the kind that sounds insufficient when you say it plainly. That the people you choose to stand beside when things are hard become, over time, the truest form of home you will ever find. Not the land, not the structure, not the legal documents that say your name on them. The people, the ones who stayed, the ones you stayed for. He had come to Grey Ridge in December for feed corn and salt blocks and a whiskey at a reasonable price. He had crossed a street because he couldn't justify not crossing it. He had made a promise to a child because she'd asked him to, and then he'd kept it, one day at a time, through all the cold and difficulty of the keeping. And the keeping had made him into something he hadn't known he still had the capacity to become. Not a better man in the way stories usually meant it. Polished, improved, redeemed by a single moment of correct behavior. Just a man who had stopped living at the perimeter of his own life, who had walked back in from the edges, who had let the things that deserved to matter actually matter. Nora looked up from her letter. She read his face. She could do that now. Read him with the same accuracy Elsie had, though through different practice. And she said nothing. She just held his gaze for a moment, and in her eyes there was everything that they had been through and everything that was still ahead, uncertain and real, and the plain fact of herself looking at him from across a room that was theirs. He sat down across from her. She went back to her letter. He found the mending he'd been putting off and got the needle threaded on the 3rd try, because it was late and his eyes were tired, and they sat at the table in the lamplight while outside the March night settled over the ranch in its bowl between the ridge lines, over the barn where Edmund stood in his stall, and the chicken coop and the fence that needed its 3rd post attended to, over the snow retreating from the south pasture and the ground under it beginning the slow particular work of becoming something. Above them in the loft, a child slept with her ribbon on a shelf and her sack beside her and her name, which she'd decided to try in a new arrangement, held somewhere between question and fact, still becoming. The fire burned, the lamp burned, the winter was almost done. Not everything was resolved. There would be more letters from Aldridge, more waiting for the court's deliberate machinery to produce what it would produce, more mornings of not knowing exactly what shape the long game would take. Clyde Rowan was somewhere in the world and probably still angry, and the law was the law, imperfect and slow and sometimes wrong. But tonight the ranch was quiet, and the 3 of them were in it, and the fire needed nothing from him for the next hour at least. He worked his mending and did not watch the clock. That too was something. That, in its own plain way, was everything.